The champagne flute trembled in my hand as Eleanor's voice carried through the mahogany doors of the Wentworth Foundation's private library. I'd stepped away from the glittering Manhattan fundraising gala for just a moment. The suffocating weight of designer gowns and manufactured smiles had become unbearable. The September air drifted through the open terrace doors, carrying with it the scent of jasmine from the rooftop garden. How fitting that the flower sharing my name would witness my world crumble. "Don't worry, darling," Eleanor's voice was honey-sweet. Poison, each word carefully enunciated in that boarding school accent that had intimidated me for 7 years. "Jasmine is just temporary, a placeholder until you find someone more suitable." Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I froze behind the library's towering shelves, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The leather-bound volumes of Wentworth family history seemed to mock me, generations of blue-blooded legacy staring down at the Mexican-American interloper who dared to dream she belonged. "I know, Mother." Julian's response was casual, almost bored, as if discussing the weather rather than my entire existence. "The prenup ensures she won't get anything substantial. Another year, maybe 2, and I'll find someone from our circle. Someone who actually belongs." The crystal slipped from my fingers, shattering against the Persian rug with a sound that seemed to echo through my very soul. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of what I'd believed was love, reduced to a business arrangement. 7 years of devotion, revealed as nothing more than a calculated performance. I am Jasmine Reyes Wentworth, though apparently, the Wentworth part was never meant to be permanent. At 34, I'd built my life around what I believed was genuine partnership, Harvard MBA, summa cum laude, a successful career in tech that I'd sacrificed to support Julian's pharmaceutical empire. A marriage I'd entered with my whole heart, believing I'd found my equal, my match, my forever. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd walked away from my own family's modest but growing tech business to prove I could succeed on merit alone. My parents, Diego and Carmen Reyes, had built their small electronics repair shop in Chicago into a thriving enterprise through sheer determination and 16-hour days. They'd taught me that authenticity was everything. Never pretend to be something you're not. Mija, my mother used to say, her calloused hands gentle, as she braided my hair before school. But never let anyone make you feel like you're not enough. Standing in that library, listening to my husband and mother-in-law discuss my expiration date like spoiled milk, I realized I'd been the only authentic person in this marriage. While I'd been building a life, they'd been executing a plan. Should I start introducing him to the Carrington girl? Eleanor's voice continued, growing stronger as she moved closer to the library doors. Celeste's family shipping fortune would complement our pharmaceutical holdings beautifully. Her bloodline is impeccable, European aristocracy on her mother's side, old American money on her father's. Not yet. Julian's tone carried that particular brand of Wentworth arrogance that I'd once found commanding, now revealed as mere entitlement. "Jasmine is still useful. She's handling our Asian expansion brilliantly." Once that Singapore deal closes, he let the sentence hang, but I understood. Once I'd served my purpose, I'd be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. I bent to collect the larger shards of crystal, my mind racing through implications with the same precision I'd once used to orchestrate billion-dollar mergers. The prenup, of course. Julian had insisted on it, claiming it was family tradition, necessary for protecting generational wealth. I'd signed it willingly, even adding clauses that favored him because I'd been so certain our love was real. The fool's gold of my naivety mocked me now. But there was something Julian didn't know, something his blue blood arrogance had made him overlook. In his world of inherited wealth and social pedigree, he'd never bothered to truly investigate where I came from. He knew I'd worked in tech before we married. He knew I'd graduated from Harvard. He knew I'd walked away from my family's modest business to build something with him. What he didn't know was that the modest business was now Reyes Technologies, a company I'd quietly built through shell corporations and silent partnerships, while playing the devoted wife. What he didn't know was that his temporary placeholder wife was worth 3 times his family's fortune. What he didn't know was that every contract he'd signed, every deal he'd closed, every expansion he'd celebrated, I'd been the invisible hand guiding it all. "Jasmine, are you in here?" Julian's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. I straightened quickly, wrapping the glass shards in my silk handkerchief. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught me to school my features into perfect neutrality. When I turned, my smile was flawless. "Just needed some air," I said, meeting his blue eyes. Those eyes I'd once found so mesmerizing now seemed as cold as wind or steel. "The gala is beautiful, but you know how these events can be." He crossed the library in 3 measured strides, his Tom Ford tuxedo impeccable as always. Every detail perfect, every gesture calculated. How had I never seen it before? "You've been gone for 20 minutes. Mother's been asking for you. The Weatherby family wants to hear about your Singapore project." "Your Singapore project?" "Not ours. Never ours." Because in the Wentworth world, wives didn't build empires, they managed them temporarily, until their husbands found suitable replacements. Of course, I moved past him, but he caught my arm with practiced concern. "You're bleeding." His brow furrowed as he examined the small cut on my palm where a crystal shard had bitten deep. I hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing." I dropped my glass. The lie came easily, smoothly. After 7 years of marriage, I'd learned to speak his language of careful omissions and strategic truths. "Let me see." He took my hand, examining the wound with the same clinical detachment his family probably used when reviewing pharmaceutical trial results. "You should clean this." "The powder room, I'll handle it." I withdrew my hand, noting how he immediately wiped his fingers on his pocket square, as if my blood might somehow contaminate his perfect image. How many times had I mistaken his performances for genuine emotion? We walked back toward the gala together, the perfect couple returning to their perfect performance. The grand ballroom glittered like a fairy tale, all crystal chandeliers and golden light. Manhattan's elite moved in careful choreography, their conversations as polished as their jewelry. I'd once felt honored to be part of this world. Now I saw it for what it was, a gilded cage where authenticity went to die. Eleanor stood near the marble fireplace, holding court among a circle of society matrons, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her navy Chanel dress making her look like the dowager empress she'd always been. Her eyes found us immediately, and her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "There you are, Jasmine." Her voice carried just enough warmth to fool the surrounding crowd. "I was just telling Mrs. Weatherby about your little project in Singapore. How industrious of you to keep working despite being a Wentworth now." Despite being a Wentworth, as if the name should have been enough to sustain me. As if I should have been content to be decorative, a pretty accessory to Julian's inherited power. "The Singapore expansion will increase Blackwood Wentworth Pharmaceuticals' Asian market share by 40%, I replied smoothly, letting my Harvard MBA show just enough to remind them that I wasn't some trophy wife. "The initial projections suggest we'll capture the premium medical device market within 18 months, with potential for—" "Please, dear." Eleanor's interruption was gentle but firm, accompanied by that tinkling laugh that had become my personal soundtrack to hell. "Let's not bore everyone with business talk. This is a fundraiser, not a board meeting." The other women tittered obligingly, but I caught something in Mrs. Weatherby's expression, a flicker of interest quickly suppressed. Margaret Weatherby had built her own shipping empire before marrying into old money. She understood what it meant to be the only person in the room who'd actually earned their fortune. I filed that observation away for later consideration. In the game I was beginning to play, every piece of information was valuable. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and small talk. I played my part perfectly, the devoted wife, the accomplished but not too accomplished daughter-in-law, the temporary fixture in the Wentworth family to blow. I smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and made conversation with people who would forget my name the moment someone more interesting walked into the room. But behind my practiced smile, my mind was building something else entirely. A plan, a reckoning. A way to make my temporary status very, very permanent, just not in the way they expected. As the gala wound down, I excused myself to the powder room, finally allowing my mask to slip for just a moment. The woman in the mirror looked composed, elegant, untouchable, but I could see the fire burning behind her dark eyes, the steel forming in her spine. They thought they knew me. They thought they could use me, discard me, replace me with someone more suitable. They thought that 7 years of marriage had been enough to understand exactly what they were dealing with. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the number I needed. Sophia Alvarez, my best friend since Harvard, now one of the most feared family attorneys in New York. If anyone could help me navigate what was coming, it would be her. The text I sent was simple: emergency. Can you meet tomorrow morning? I need to discuss something that requires absolute confidentiality. Her response came within minutes. My office. What do you need? I typed back. A divorce attorney. And maybe a miracle. The phone slipped back into my clutch as I returned to the ballroom for the final round of goodbyes. Julian was waiting, his arm extended for the perfect photo op as we prepared to leave. I slipped my hand through his elbow, feeling the expensive fabric of his tuxedo, the solid warmth of his arm. For 7 years, that touch had meant safety, partnership, love. Now it felt like shaking hands with a stranger. Ready to go home, darling? He asked, his voice carrying that tender inflection he'd perfected for public consumption. More than ready, I replied, and for the first time all evening, I was telling the absolute truth. As our driver navigated the gleaming streets of Manhattan, I stared out at the city lights, each one a possibility, opportunity, a chance to rewrite the story they'd written for me. The temporary wife was about to become something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined, permanent. The penthouse was eerily quiet when we returned, our footsteps echoing against the marble floors like a funeral march. 50 floors above Manhattan, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city that never sleeps. But tonight, even New York felt like it was holding its breath. I'm going to change, Julian announced, already loosening his bow tie as he headed toward the master bedroom. Early morning tomorrow. The board meeting about the Singapore expansion. My Singapore expansion. The deal I'd orchestrated. The contacts I'd cultivated. The months of 16-hour days I'd invested to make Julian look like a visionary leader. Also, he could use it as his crowning achievement before disposing of me. I'll be up in a moment, I called back, my voice steady despite the hurricane building inside my chest. Just need to review some files. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close, then moved to my study, the one space in this mausoleum Julian had never shown any interest in. While he'd claimed the grand office with its view of Central Park, I'd chosen the smaller room facing east, where I could watch the sun rise over the city I'd conquered brick by brick. The secret was hidden in plain sight. Among the carefully curated shelves of business books and industry reports sat an innocuous laptop, sleek and black, no different from any other executive's computer. But this one contained something Julian had never bothered to look for: the truth about exactly who he'd married. My fingers flew across the keyboard, entering the 17-digit encryption code that would unlock files I'd been building for years. The screen flickered to life, revealing the interface of Reyes Technologies' internal network. Bank statements, incorporation documents, patent filings, and contract agreements filled the screen in neat, organized folders. 3 billion in assets, 47 subsidiary companies, a network of shell corporations that spanned 3 continents. And at the center of it all, a woman who'd been playing the role of devoted wife while secretly building an empire that dwarfed her husband's inherited fortune. I pulled up the Singapore files first. Every email, every contract, every strategic decision that had made the Blackwood Wentworth expansion possible. Julian's signature was on the final documents, but my fingerprints were on everything else. The connections with Asian pharmaceutical distributors, the regulatory approval process, the manufacturing partnerships, all of it had been orchestrated through my network, my relationships, my expertise. The beautiful irony was that he'd never questioned how effortlessly everything had fallen into place. In his world of inherited privilege, success was expected, not earned. He'd never stopped to wonder why every door opened for him, why every negotiation went his way, why every competitor seemed to stumble at exactly the right moment. Because he'd never bothered to truly investigate the woman sharing his bed. I scrolled through the communications logs, watching months of careful manipulation unfold in real time. The Singaporean health minister who'd expedited their approval process. His daughter had received a full scholarship to MIT, funded by an anonymous donor. The pharmaceutical distributor who'd offered them exclusive territory rights. His company had been struggling with supply chain issues until a mysterious competitor had offered to solve their problems at cost. Julian thought he was building an empire. I'd been pulling the strings all along. My phone buzzed a text from Sophia. Can't sleep either? This must be serious. I typed back. Worse than you can imagine. How quickly can you get me out of a prenup? Depends on the terms. Forward me a copy if you have it. I did, of course. Every document Julian had ever asked me to sign was stored in my encrypted files, analyzed by lawyers he'd never known I'd consulted. The prenup had been airtight at least. It would have been if I'd actually been the struggling tech worker he'd believed he was marrying. Sophia's response came within minutes. Holy shit, Jasmine. This is brutal, but there might be loopholes. If you can prove fraud or concealment. Fraud. Concealment. The words felt like weapons in my hands. I opened another folder, this one labeled personal insurance. Inside were recordings 7 years of conversations I'd never expected to need. In the tech world, protecting your intellectual property was second nature. I'd simply applied the same principle to my marriage. The first recording was from our 3rd anniversary dinner. Julian's voice, warm with wine and what I'd believed was affection. Sometimes I can't believe I found you, Jasmine. You're like a secret weapon I didn't know I needed. A secret weapon. Even his romantic declarations had been transactional. The second recording was from last Christmas, when Julian had been complaining to his college roommate about the pressures of running a family business. Thank God Jasmine handles all the Asian market research. I swear, she's got connections I could never build. Mother keeps asking when I'm going to start a family. But honestly, Jason, this woman is more valuable than a dozen heirs, more valuable than children, more valuable than love, more valuable than a lifetime partnership. But only until someone more suitable came along. The third recording was from 6 months ago, during a dinner party where Julian had been discussing the Singapore expansion with potential investors. My wife has this uncanny ability to make connections in markets where we've never had a presence. It's like she's got some kind of network I can't even see. A network he couldn't see, because he'd never bothered to look. I closed the recording file and opened the most dangerous folder of all, Blackwood Wentworth Vulnerabilities. If Julian wanted to play the game of strategic marriages and corporate maneuvering, he'd picked the wrong opponent. The pharmaceutical industry was built on secrets, clinical trials that showed inconvenient side effects, regulatory approvals that had been expedited through strategic donations, manufacturing processes that cut corners to maximize profits. For 3 years, I'd been Julian's closest advisor, privy to every board meeting, every strategic decision, every carefully buried scandal. I'd kept meticulous records, thinking I was protecting our shared future. Now I realized I'd been building a nuclear arsenal. The first document was explosive enough to end careers, internal memos showing that Blackwood Wentworth had known about liver toxicity in their arthritis medication for 18 months before reporting it to the FDA. The second was even worse. Email chains revealing that they'd manipulated clinical trial data to hide cardiovascular risks in their diabetes treatment. Julian's voice echoed in my memory. Sometimes you have to weigh the greater good against individual risk. That's what leadership means. I'd thought he was talking about business philosophy. Now I understood he'd been justifying potential murder. The third document was the most damning of all. Financial records showing that Eleanor Wentworth had been systematically embezzling from the family foundation, using charity funds to pay for personal expenses while claiming tax deductions that bordered on fraud. They'd called me temporary. They'd planned to use me, exploit my expertise, then discard me for someone with the right bloodline. But they'd made a crucial error in their calculations. They'd assumed I was weak. They'd assumed I was desperate. They'd assumed I was the kind of woman who would accept whatever scraps they threw her way. They'd never stopped to consider that the woman they were betraying might be more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. I reached for my personal phone, scrolling through contacts until I found another number I hadn't called in months. Meena Patel, my COO and the closest thing I had to a sister in the business world. If anyone could help me navigate the corporate warfare that was coming, it would be her. Jasmine, Meena's voice was alert despite the late hour. Are you okay? You never call this late unless I need you to accelerate timeline 7, I interrupted. Using the code we'd established for our most sensitive projects. Full implementation. Tomorrow morning. There was a pause. Timeline 7 was our nuclear option, the plan we'd developed for extracting all Reyes Technologies assets from any entanglement with Julian's business interests. We'd hoped we'd never need it. What happened? Meena's voice was sharp with concern. I'll explain everything tomorrow. But Meena, I need you to know that everything we've built, everything we've worked for, it's about to be put to the test. You know I'm with you, she said without hesitation. Whatever you need. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen full of evidence, assets, and ammunition. For 7 years, I'd been building 2 lives, the one Julian saw, and the one I'd kept hidden. The devoted wife who supported her husband's ambitions, and the tech mogul who'd been pulling strings from the shadows. Now those 2 lives were about to collide. In the distance, I could hear Julian moving around the bedroom, probably checking his phone for messages from board members or investors. He was preparing for tomorrow's meeting, where he'd present the Singapore expansion as his own vision, his own achievement, where he'd bask in the applause of men who'd never suspect that everything they were celebrating had been orchestrated by the woman they saw as his pretty accessory. But I was preparing for something else entirely. I was preparing for war. The woman Julian had married, the struggling tech worker who'd been grateful for his attention, eager to support his ambitions, willing to sacrifice her own dreams for his. That woman was about to die. In her place would rise someone far more dangerous, someone who'd been underestimated for the last time. I opened one final file, a document I'd hoped I'd never need to use. It was a comprehensive dossier on Celeste Carrington, the woman Eleanor had chosen as my replacement. 28 years old, daughter of European shipping heiress Victoria Carrington and American steel magnate Charles Carrington. Educated at exclusive Swiss boarding schools, graduated from Oxford with a degree in art history. No real career, no independent income, no power base beyond her family connections. In other words, the perfect Wentworth wife. Beautiful, accomplished, enough to be impressive at dinner parties, but not so accomplished as to threaten the men around her. Someone who would be grateful for the privilege of the Wentworth name, who would never question their methods or challenge their authority. Someone who would never see them coming. But as I read through Celeste's background, I began to see something else. The Swiss boarding school she'd attended specialized in international relations. Her Oxford thesis had been on economic policy in developing nations. Her family's shipping empire had been built on emerging markets and strategic partnerships. Maybe Celeste Carrington wasn't as decorative as Eleanor assumed. Maybe she was simply another woman who'd learned to hide her intelligence behind a socially acceptable facade. If that was the case, then maybe she wasn't my enemy. Maybe she was my opportunity. The clock on my laptop showed 3:47 a.m. In 4 hours, I would have breakfast with Sophia and begin the process of legally extracting myself from this marriage. In 6 hours, Mina would arrive at her office and begin implementing our most aggressive corporate strategy. In 8 hours, Julian would walk into that board meeting believing he was presenting his greatest triumph. He had no idea that he was about to face his greatest defeat. I closed the laptop and stood up, my reflection catching in the dark windows. The woman looking back at me was no longer the trusting wife who'd believed in love and partnership. She was someone harder, sharper, more focused. She was someone who'd been underestimated for the last time. As I made my way to the bedroom, I could hear Julian's steady breathing, the sound of a man sleeping peacefully in his bed of lies. Tomorrow, he would wake up to a world where his temporary wife had become his permanent problem. And I was going to enjoy every second of watching his perfect life crumble. The Gramercy Park Hotel's private dining room hummed with the kind of subdued elegance that made Manhattan's elite feel at home. Crystal clinked against fine china as the city's most powerful players gathered for the monthly Innovation in Healthcare dinner, a carefully orchestrated event where pharmaceutical executives, tech moguls, and investors could make deals while pretending to discuss industry progress. I sat beside Julian at the head table, my burgundy silk dress chosen specifically to complement his navy suit. We looked like the perfect power couple, and I played the part flawlessly. Every smile calculated, every gesture practiced, every word designed to support the illusion that Julian Wentworth was a visionary leader rather than a man coasting on inherited privilege and his wife's secret expertise. The Singapore expansion represents more than just market penetration, Julian was explaining to a circle of fascinated investors. It's about understanding the cultural nuances of Asian healthcare systems, building relationships that transcend traditional business boundaries. My relationships, my cultural understanding, my 3 years of painstaking work to build trust with distributors, regulators, and healthcare providers who would never have given Julian a second glance if he'd approached them directly. Your wife's involvement must have been invaluable, commented David Chen, senior partner at Meridian Capital. He was one of the few Asian American investors at the table, and his knowing look suggested he understood exactly who had really made those connections. The Asian market can be challenging for Western companies. Jasmine has been wonderfully supportive, Julian replied, his hand finding mine in what would look like an affectionate gesture to anyone watching. His fingers were cold. She has such a gift for connecting with people from different backgrounds. A gift for connecting with people from different backgrounds. As if my Mexican-American heritage was some kind of exotic networking tool rather than the foundation of my identity. I'm sure she does, David said, his tone carefully neutral. But when he caught my eye, I saw something there, recognition, perhaps, or speculation. I leaned forward slightly, engaging him directly. The key to succeeding in Asian markets isn't just cultural sensitivity, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who actually understood the subject. It's about long-term relationship building. Most Western companies want immediate results, but Asian business culture values patience, trust, and mutual respect. Exactly, David nodded, his interest clearly piqued. Too many American companies try to impose their models without understanding local contexts, which is why we spent 18 months just building relationships before we even mentioned business. I continued, ignoring the subtle tension in Julian's posture. In Singapore, especially, the healthcare system is incredibly sophisticated. They don't need another Western company telling them how to modernize. They need partners who respect their expertise. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with me providing insights that had Julian's fellow executives leaning forward with interest. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes. This wasn't just some trophy wife making polite conversation. This was someone who understood markets, strategies, and opportunities in ways that could make them money. More importantly, I could see them beginning to question exactly who deserved credit for the Singapore expansion's success. As the evening progressed, I excused myself to freshen up, knowing that Julian would be too engaged with his cigar and brandy ritual to notice how long I was gone. The hotel's powder room was empty except for one other woman, Margaret Weatherby, the shipping heiress who'd shown interest in my comments at the gala. Jasmine, she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there at Eleanor's fundraiser. I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, about the Singapore project. Oh, I replied, touching up my lipstick in the mirror while watching her reflection. My shipping company has been looking for pharmaceutical partners in Southeast Asia. The regulatory environment there is complex, but if you have the right connections. She let the sentence hang, but her meaning was clear. I'm sure Julian would be happy to discuss potential partnerships, I said carefully. Margaret's laugh was knowing. My dear, I've been in this business for 30 years. I know the difference between a figurehead and the person who actually makes things happen. She moved closer, her voice dropping. If you're ever interested in exploring opportunities outside the Wentworth umbrella, I'd be very interested in having that conversation. The offer hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't quite ready to cross. But I filed it away with everything else I was collecting, every connection, every opportunity, every piece of leverage I might need in the war that was coming. I'll keep that in mind, I said, my tone neutral but my eyes conveying that I'd heard her message loud and clear. When I returned to the dining room, Julian was holding court with a group of investors, his voice animated as he described the challenges of breaking into Asian markets. Everything he was saying came from my research, my reports, my strategic analyses, but he delivered it with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to claim credit for other people's work. The key insight, he was saying, is that Western pharmaceutical companies have been approaching Asia all wrong. They've been trying to impose American business models on markets that operate completely differently. My key insight, from a report I'd written 18 months ago. That's fascinating, said Patricia Vance, CEO of Vance Pharmaceuticals and one of the few women at the executive level. How did you come to that understanding? Julian's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. Well, it was really a matter of immersing ourselves in the culture, spending time with local partners, learning to see the market through their eyes, ourselves. As if he'd been there for the months I'd spent in Singapore, building relationships while he'd been in the Hamptons. As if he'd been present for the late-night calls with distributors, the careful navigation of regulatory requirements, the cultural missteps I'd learned from and corrected. But Patricia was sharp, and she'd caught something in Julian's tone that suggested he was reciting rather than remembering. Her eyes found mine across the table, and I saw the same recognition that had been in David Chen's expression. these weren't fools. They were successful business leaders who'd built their own empires through intelligence, instinct, and the ability to spot authenticity from a mile away. And they were beginning to suspect that the real architect of Blackwood Wentworth's Asian expansion wasn't the man taking credit for it. As the evening wound down, I found myself in conversation with 3 different investors, each of whom had made subtle inquiries about my background, my expertise, my role in the Singapore project. By the time Julian and I climbed into our town car for the ride home, I had business cards from 2 venture capital firms and a private equity group that specialized in healthcare technology. That went well, Julian said, settling back into the leather seat with satisfaction. The Meridian people seemed particularly interested in the expansion strategy. They did, I agreed, watching the city lights blur past the window. Patricia? Vance was asking some pointed questions about our implementation timeline. I think she might be interested in partnering on similar projects in other markets. Our implementation timeline. Even now, even after everything I'd overheard, he couldn't help but frame my work as a collaborative effort, as if I'd been his junior partner rather than the invisible architect of his success. That could be interesting, I said noncommittally. Julian's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and I caught the slight smile that crossed his face before he quickly composed his expression. But I'd already seen what I needed to see, because I'd been monitoring his phone for the past 6 months. The message was from Celeste Carrington. Lovely evening at the Met benefit. Hope to see you at the Hamptons polo match this weekend. Julian typed back. Wouldn't miss it. Save me a dance? I kept my face carefully neutral, but inside, something cold and sharp was crystallizing. The Hamptons polo match. The same event where Eleanor had first introduced Julian to his future wife, where she'd orchestrated their chance encounter. The same event where I'd be expected to smile and play the gracious wife while watching my husband court my replacement. But this time, I wouldn't be the unsuspecting victim watching from the sidelines. This time, I'd be the one orchestrating the performance. Are you planning to attend the polo match this weekend? I asked casually. Julian's slight hesitation confirmed everything I needed to know. I should probably make an appearance. The foundation sponsors the event, and Mother expects the family to be represented. The family. Not us. Not we. The family as if I'd never been part of it. As if my 7 years of marriage had been some kind of extended audition for a role I'd never actually been cast in. Of course, I said. I'll make sure my schedule is clear. He nodded absently, already composing another text. But I was done being the wife who quietly accommodated his secret communications. I was done being the woman who made excuses for his emotional distance. I was done being the temporary placeholder in his permanent plans. By the time we reached the penthouse, I had a clear picture of what the next few days would bring. Julian would spend the weekend at the polo match, deepening his connection with Celeste while I played the oblivious wife. Eleanor would continue her campaign to position the Carrington girl as the perfect replacement for the inconvenient Mexican-American interloper. And I would continue to be the successful, accomplished woman whose expertise they needed but whose presence they barely tolerated. But they were about to discover that the woman they'd been underestimating had been playing a much longer game than they'd ever imagined. As Julian headed to his office to catch up on some paperwork, I made my way to my study and opened my laptop. It was time to make some calls. The first was to Meena Patel, my COO, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. Timeline 7 is fully implemented, she reported without preamble. All Reyes tech assets are now completely isolated from any Wentworth entanglements. The Singapore contracts are particularly interesting technically. They're all with subsidiary companies you control, not with Blackwood Wentworth directly, which means that if you wanted to, you could pull the plug on the entire expansion tomorrow. Every distribution agreement, every regulatory approval, every manufacturing partnership, it all depends on companies that you personally own. The implications were staggering. Julian thought he was building his legacy on the Singapore expansion. In reality, he was building it on a foundation I could collapse with a single phone call. Keep that option available, I said. But don't implement it yet. I want to see how far they're willing to push this. My second call was to Ethan Morgan, the investigative journalist whose exposés on pharmaceutical corruption had made him a legend in the industry. We'd never met, but I'd been following his work for years. "This is Ethan," he answered, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and late nights. "Mr. Morgan, this is Jasmine Wentworth. I believe I have information that might interest you." There was a pause. "Blackwood Wentworth Pharmaceuticals?" "Among other things. I'm wondering if you'd be interested in meeting for coffee tomorrow. I have some documents that might shed light on certain industry practices." "What kind of documents?" "The kind that show the difference between what pharmaceutical companies report to regulators and what they actually know about their products' safety profiles." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Are you available tomorrow afternoon for this?" "I'll make time." The third call was to Sophia, who picked up before the first ring finished. "Please tell me you have good news," she said without preamble. "Better than good news. I have ammunition." "How quickly can you file preliminary divorce papers?" "If you're serious about this, I can have them ready by Friday." "But Jasmine, are you absolutely certain?" "Once we start this process, I'm certain." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but they felt right. "They want to play games with my life, treat me like a disposable asset. They're about to learn that I'm not the woman they thought they married." "What do you need from me?" "Everything. I want you to examine every contract, every agreement, every document Julian has ever signed. I want to know exactly what he owns, what he controls, and what he thinks he can take from me, and what you can take from him." "Exactly." After ending the call, I sat in the darkness of my study, surrounded by the evidence of 7 years of careful planning. Julian thought he was the chess master, moving pieces around a board he'd inherited from his father. But I'd been playing a different game entirely, one where the queen had been masquerading as a pawn, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal her true power. The weekend polo match would be that moment. While Julian courted his replacement and Eleanor orchestrated their public debut, I would be orchestrating something far more devastating. By Sunday evening, the Wentworth family would understand that they'd made a crucial error in their calculations. They'd assumed that temporary meant disposable. They were about to learn that temporary could also mean explosive. I opened my laptop one final time and began typing an email to David Chen, the Meridian Capital investor who'd shown such interest in my insights during dinner. The message was carefully crafted, professional but warm, with just enough substance to intrigue without revealing too much. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to thank you for such an engaging conversation this evening. Your insights into Asian market dynamics were particularly thought-provoking. I'd love to continue our discussion about the opportunities for strategic partnerships in Southeast Asia, particularly in the pharmaceutical sector. Would you be interested in meeting for coffee next week to explore some ideas I've been developing?" The response came within minutes. "Miss Wentworth, I would be very interested in that conversation. I have a feeling you have insights that could be valuable to our portfolio companies. Are you available Tuesday afternoon?" "Perfect." By Tuesday, the first phase of my plan would be complete. Julian would be publicly committed to his courtship of Celeste, Eleanor would have revealed her true intentions, and I would be ready to emerge from the shadows as something far more dangerous than a discarded wife. I would be a competitor. As I finally made my way to the bedroom, I could hear Julian's voice drifting from his office, low and intimate in the way that used to make my heart race. Now I knew he was talking to Celeste, making plans for their weekend encounter, building the foundation for the relationship that was supposed to replace our marriage. But as I slipped into bed beside him, I couldn't help but smile. Because while Julian was focused on his next move, I was already 3 steps ahead. And the game he thought he was winning was about to become the battle that would define the rest of his life. The temporary wife was about to become a permanent problem, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching his perfect world burn. The Hamptons polo match was exactly what I'd expected, a carefully choreographed display of wealth, privilege, and social positioning disguised as a sporting event. The emerald grass stretched endlessly under a perfect September sky, while Manhattan's elite sipped champagne and pretended to understand the intricacies of horsemanship. I stood beneath a white canvas tent, my cream silk dress and wide-brimmed hat chosen specifically to photograph well against the pastoral backdrop. The outfit was perfect for the role I was supposed to play, the supportive wife, the elegant accessory, the woman who looked beautiful in photos but never overshadowed her husband's accomplishments. Julian was holding court near the paddock, explaining polo strategy to a group of investors who'd probably never been on a horse in their lives. His riding boots were polished to perfection, his polo shirt crisp and white, his smile confident and commanding. He looked like he belonged in this world of inherited privilege and casual luxury. But I was watching someone else entirely, Celeste. Carrington stood at the edge of Julian's circle, her posture perfect, her attention focused, her responses precisely calibrated to show interest without appearing too eager. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 26 or 27, with the kind of effortless blonde beauty that suggested Swiss boarding schools and European summers. Her dress was pale blue Chanel, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive, her smile warm but carefully controlled. She was perfect. Absolutely, devastatingly perfect for the role Eleanor had cast her in. But as I watched her interact with Julian's friends, I began to notice things that didn't quite fit the decorative heiress narrative. When someone mentioned emerging markets in Southeast Asia, her eyes sharpened with genuine interest. When the conversation turned to pharmaceutical regulations, she asked questions that revealed more than passing knowledge. When Julian made a comment about the challenges of cultural adaptation in business, she offered insights that were both sophisticated and specific. This wasn't the empty-headed socialite I'd expected. This was a woman who'd been educated, informed, and carefully prepared for exactly this kind of conversation. The question was whether she understood the game she was playing, or whether she was as naive about the Wentworth family's true nature as I'd been 7 years ago. I was about to find out. "Celeste, darling," Eleanor's voice rang out across the crowd as she approached the group, her arms extended in a gesture of maternal warmth. "You look absolutely radiant. That dress is stunning on you." "Thank you, Mrs. Wentworth. You're too kind." Celeste's response was perfect, gracious, humble, with just enough genuine warmth to seem authentic. "I was just telling the Weatherbys about your family's shipping empire," Eleanor continued, her tone carefully casual. "Such a fascinating business. I imagine you've learned so much about international commerce. My father always said that shipping was really about understanding people," Celeste replied, her smile never wavering. "Every port, every country, every culture has its own way of doing business. Success comes from respecting those differences rather than trying to impose your own methods." The insight was sophisticated, nuanced, and delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested genuine expertise. This woman had been raised in the family business, not just around it. Julian stepped closer to Celeste, his body language protective and possessive in a way that made my chest tighten with something that might have been jealousy if I hadn't moved so far beyond such simple emotions. Celeste was just telling me about her family's expansion into sustainable shipping technologies. "It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need in pharmaceuticals." As if he and Celeste were already a team, already planning their shared future while I stood 10 feet away, playing the role of the oblivious wife. "How innovative," I said, stepping into the conversation with my own perfectly calibrated smile. "I'm Jasmine Wentworth. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Celeste's eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in their depths, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. But her recovery was flawless. "Of course. I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Wentworth. Your work on the Singapore expansion has been the talk of the industry." Interesting. She knew about my work, not just Julian's. Either she'd done her homework, or someone had briefed her on exactly what she'd be replacing. "Please, call me Jasmine. And thank you, it's been a fascinating project. There's something uniquely challenging about breaking into markets that have been dominated by local players for decades. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. "I imagine the cultural barriers are the most significant," Celeste said, her interest seeming genuine. "In shipping, we've learned that success in Asian markets requires a completely different approach than what works in Europe or America." We talked for another 10 minutes, the conversation flowing naturally between business strategy, cultural adaptation, and market analysis. With each exchange, I became more certain that Celeste Carrington was not the decorative heiress Eleanor believed. She was grooming. This was a woman with real intelligence, real business acumen, and real understanding of the complexities of international commerce, which made her either a formidable enemy or a valuable ally. Julian and Eleanor gradually drifted away to greet other guests, leaving Celeste and me alone beneath the tent. The moment felt charged with possibility. Two women who understood they were being positioned as adversaries, but who might have more in common than either of their manipulators realized. Your husband speaks very highly of your expertise, Celeste said, her tone carefully neutral. He's been very supportive of my work, I replied, matching her diplomatic tone. Though I suspect he sometimes gets more credit than he deserves. A small smile played at the corners of Celeste's mouth. In my experience, that's often the case with men in family businesses. They have a tendency to assume that success is their birthright rather than something that must be earned. The comment was subtle, but its implications were clear. Celeste understood exactly what kind of man Julian was, and exactly what kind of family she was being groomed to marry into. You speak from experience? I asked. My father built his shipping empire from nothing, she said, her voice carrying a note of genuine pride. But my brother inherited his position as CEO, and somehow everyone assumes he's the visionary behind our recent expansion into sustainable technologies. When in reality, those innovations came from the Sustainable Shipping Consortium I've been developing for the past 3 years. But Charles gets the credit because he's the one with the title. There it was, the confirmation I'd been looking for. Celeste wasn't just intelligent, she was ambitious, frustrated, and intimately familiar with the experience of being underestimated by the men around her. That must be frustrating, I said carefully. It's educational, she replied, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. You learn to be strategic about when to reveal your capabilities and when to let people underestimate you. We looked at each other for a long moment, two women who understood the game being played around us, even if we were supposedly on opposite sides of it. Can I ask you something? Celeste said finally. Of course. Eleanor Wentworth has been very attentive to me recently, inviting me to events, introducing me to Julian's friends, making sure I'm included in family gatherings. Is there something I should know about her intentions? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could lie, play the loyal wife, pretend that I had no idea what Eleanor was orchestrating. Or I could tell the truth and see what this intriguing woman would do with it. Eleanor believes in strategic marriages, I said finally. She thinks compatibility is less important than complementary assets and social positioning, and she sees my family's shipping fortune as complementary to the Wentworth pharmaceutical empire. Among other things, Celeste nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. And where does that leave you? That, I said, remains to be seen. Before Celeste could respond, Julian reappeared at my elbow, his smile tight, with barely concealed irritation. Jasmine, darling, the Weatherbees are asking for you. Something about potential partnerships in Asian markets. The interruption was clearly intentional. He'd been watching us, growing uncomfortable with how long his wife and his prospective replacement had been talking. But I'd learned what I needed to know. Of course, I said, then turned back to Celeste. It was lovely meeting you, Celeste. I hope we'll have the chance to continue our conversation soon. I'd like that very much, she replied, and I could see in her eyes that she meant it. As Julian and I walked toward the Weatherby group, I could feel his tension in the rigid line of his shoulders, the careful distance he maintained between us. What were you discussing with Celeste? He asked, his tone carefully casual. Business, I replied truthfully. Her family's shipping innovations are quite impressive. The kind of forward-thinking approach that could revolutionize supply chain management in pharmaceuticals. Julian's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. I didn't realize you were familiar with her work. I make it my business to understand potential partners, I said, letting just enough edge creep into my voice to remind him that I wasn't as naive as he'd been assuming. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of champagne, small talk, and strategic positioning. I played my role perfectly, the devoted wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who enhanced her husband's reputation without overshadowing it. But beneath the performance, I was cataloging every interaction, every relationship, every opportunity. That might prove useful in the war that was coming. By the time we returned to Manhattan, I had a clear picture of the battlefield. Julian was more committed to his courtship of Celeste than I'd realized, not just as a business arrangement, but as a genuine attraction. Eleanor was accelerating her timeline, introducing Celeste to key family friends and business partners with increasing frequency, and Celeste herself was far more complex than any of them had anticipated. Most importantly, I'd identified my next move. That evening, as Julian retreated to his office for his usual Sunday night business calls with Celeste, I opened my laptop and began crafting an email that would change everything. Dear Celeste, I typed, I found our conversation this afternoon fascinating and would love to continue it in a more private setting. Would you be interested in meeting for coffee this week? I have some insights about the Wentworth family that I think might be valuable to you. Best regards, Jasmine. The message was sent before I could second guess myself. Within an hour, I had a response. Jasmine, I would be very interested in that conversation. Are you available Tuesday afternoon? I have a feeling we have more in common than either of us initially realized. Looking forward to it, Celeste. Perfect. By Tuesday, I would know whether Celeste Carrington was the naive pawn Eleanor believed she was grooming, or whether she was something far more dangerous, a woman who understood the game and was playing it for her own purposes. Either way, the alliance I was about to propose would change everything. Because if there was one thing I'd learned from 7 years of marriage to Julian Wentworth, it was that the most dangerous enemy was the one you underestimated, and both Julian and Eleanor had made the fatal mistake of underestimating both of the women whose lives they were trying to manipulate. The temporary wife was about to find herself a permanent ally, and together, we were going to destroy the world that had tried to destroy us. The familiar scent of my mother's cooking hit me the moment I stepped off the plane at O'Hare. Not the literal scent. Of course, I was still in the sterile confines of the airport terminal, but the memory of it, rising from somewhere deep in my chest like a physical embrace. Chicago in October carried the promise of winter, the kind of crisp air that made everything feel possible and urgent at the same time. I hadn't been home in 8 months. Julian's calendar had been packed with board meetings, charity galas, and strategic dinners that required my presence as the perfect wife. But this time, I'd simply announced I was taking a long weekend to visit my father, and Julian had been too distracted by his Celeste courtship to object. The ride to my childhood neighborhood took 45 minutes through traffic that would have frustrated the Manhattan version of myself. But today, I found the slowness soothing. The city sprawled around me, blocks of working-class houses and small businesses that had survived decades of economic upheaval through sheer determination and community support. This was where I'd learned that success wasn't inherited, it was earned, fought for, and protected. My father's house sat on a tree-lined street that had seen better days but still maintained its dignity. The small front yard was immaculate. The walkway swept clean, the porch light burning bright even in the afternoon sun. Diego Reyes had always believed that presentation mattered, that taking pride in what you had was the first step toward building something better. Mija. His voice boomed from the front door before I'd even reached the steps. At 72, my father was still broad-shouldered and strong, his hands calloused from 4 decades of mechanical work before he'd built his electronics business into something that could support 3 generations of family. His hug was fierce, familiar, and exactly what I needed. Pap, the word came out thick with emotions I'd been holding back for weeks. I missed you. Come. I made your favorite carnitas with the peppers from your mother's garden. He led me through the house that had been my sanctuary for 18 years, past walls covered with family photos and certificates of achievement. My Harvard diploma hung next to his citizenship papers, a reminder of how far we'd traveled together. The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the kind of natural light that Manhattan's glass towers could never replicate. I sat at the same wooden table where I'd done homework, planned my future, and dreamed of conquering the world. Now I was back, planning to reclaim that world from the people who'd tried to steal it from me. You look tired, Mija, my father said, his dark eyes studying my face with the kind of paternal insight that saw through any performance. And thin. Are you eating enough? I'm fine, Pap. Things have been complicated lately, he said. A plate of steaming carnitas before me, along with warm tortillas and fresh salsa that made my mouth water. Complicated how? With Julian? I took a bite, letting the familiar flavors ground me in this place where I'd learned to be authentic, where pretense had never been necessary. Do you remember what Mom used to say about people who mistake kindness for weakness? Diego's expression grew serious. She said they learn the difference too late to matter. I think I'm about to teach someone that lesson, for the next hour. I told my father everything, not the strategic details he didn't need to know about shell corporations and hidden assets, but the emotional truth. How I'd discovered that my marriage had been a transaction, that my husband had been planning to discard me, that the family I'd devoted 7 years to serving had never considered me anything more than a temporary convenience. My father listened, without interruption, his weathered hands folded on the table, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Your mother, he said finally, she saw this coming. What do you mean? When you brought Julian home that first time, she was polite, gracious. But after he left, she said, that boy has never been hungry a day in his life. He doesn't understand what it means to earn something. I told her she was being too harsh, that not everyone had to struggle to be worthy of love. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. She said, Diego, I'm not talking about struggle. I'm talking about respect. That boy respects what he wants from our daughter, but he doesn't respect who she is. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Carmen Reyes had died 5 years ago, but her insight had been perfect. Julian had wanted my intelligence, my connections, my ability to solve problems he couldn't handle. But he'd never respected the woman who possessed those qualities. I should have listened to her, I said quietly. No, Mija, you should have lived your life. Love makes us hopeful, and hope makes us blind to things we might otherwise see. There's no shame in that. He reached across the table and took my hand. But now you see clearly. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I'm going to remind them that underestimating someone doesn't make them weak. It makes them dangerous. My father's smile was sharp and proud. Carmen would be very proud of you right now. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the dreams and ambitions of a younger version of myself. My laptop was open, showing the secure connection to Reyes Technologies network. It was time to begin the process of separating everything I'd built from the Wentworth empire that had tried to claim it. The first call was to Meena Patel, who was working late in her San Francisco office. How's the family visit? She asked, her voice warmed despite the business nature of our relationship. Enlightening. Are you ready to implement the full separation protocol? I've been ready for months. All we need is your authorization. You have it. I want every contract, every partnership, every joint venture that ties Reyes Tech to Blackwood Wentworth dissolved or restructured. Make it clean, make it legal, and make it final. This is going to cause some serious disruption in their quarterly projections, Meena warned. Good. That's exactly what I want. And the Singapore expansion? I paused, considering. The Singapore project was Julian's crown jewel, the achievement that would cement his reputation as a visionary leader. It was also entirely dependent on relationships and contracts that I controlled through subsidiary companies. Leave it operational for now. But make sure every single agreement runs through entities that Julian has no claim to. If I decide to pull the plug, I want to be able to do it instantly. Consider it done. Jasmine? Yes? I hope you know what you're doing. This isn't just about money or business. You're about to go to war with some very powerful people, I know. But they started this war the moment they decided I was disposable. I'm just finishing it. The second call was to Sophia, who answered despite the late hour. Please tell me you have good news, she said. Better than good news. I have authorization to move forward with everything we discussed. I want the preliminary divorce papers filed by Friday, and I want them to be devastating. Define devastating. I want Julian to understand that he's not just losing a wife. He's losing access to everything that made him successful. The connections, the expertise, the strategic partnerships, all of it was mine, and all of it goes with me. That's going to require some creative legal maneuvering. That's why I hired the best flatterer. But seriously, Jasmine, are you prepared for the retaliation? Because once we file these papers, there's no going back. I've been preparing for this longer than they realize. Trust me, Sophia. By the time they understand what's happening, it will be too late to stop it. The third call was to David Chen at Meridian Capital, who had responded to my coffee invitation with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness. Jasmine, he said, his voice warm, I've been looking forward to our conversation, as have I. I wanted to discuss some opportunities that might interest your portfolio companies. I'm listening. I've been developing a network of strategic partnerships in Asian markets, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, technology platforms, the kind of relationships that take years to build but can transform market position overnight. That sounds significant. It is. And I'm considering making those relationships available to partners who understand their value and are willing to invest in long-term strategic growth rather than short-term profit maximization. There was a pause. Are we talking about opportunities independent of Blackwood Wentworth? We're talking about opportunities that transcend traditional corporate structures. I believe the future of international business lies in networks of strategic partnerships rather than monolithic corporate hierarchies. I'd very much like to hear more about this. Excellent. I'll be back in New York tomorrow. Are you available? For lunch on Wednesday? I'll make myself available. The fourth call was the most delicate to Ethan Morgan, the investigative journalist who had built his career on exposing corporate corruption. Miss Wentworth, he said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent decades uncovering uncomfortable truths. I've been researching your husband's company since our last conversation. There are some interesting discrepancies in their regulatory filings. I'm sure there are. How would you like access to the documents that explain those discrepancies? I'd like that very much. But I have to ask, what's your motivation here? Why are you willing to expose your husband's company? Let's just say I've recently discovered that my relationship with Blackwood Wentworth is more complicated than I previously understood. Complicated how? That's a conversation for when we meet in person. Are you available tomorrow afternoon? For this story? I'm available whenever you are. The final call was to my father, who was reading in the living room downstairs. Pap, could you come up here for a moment? He appeared in my doorway, concern etched in his weathered features. What is it? Mija, I need to tell you something important about the business, about what I've built. I showed him the laptop screen, the network of companies and partnerships that comprised Reyes Technologies. His eyes widened as he absorbed the scope of what I'd created, not just a business, but an empire that stretched across 3 continents and generated billions in revenue. Dios emo, he whispered. Jasmine, how did you? I built it the way you taught me, one relationship at a time. One contract at a time, one decision at a time. I never stopped working, never stopped growing, never stopped planning for the future. But why didn't you tell us? Because I was trying to be 2 people at once. The dutiful wife who supported her husband's ambitions, and the entrepreneur who was building her own empire. I thought I could be both. I was wrong. My father studied the screen for a long moment, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but also something deeper, recognition, perhaps, of the woman his daughter had become. Your mother knew, he said quietly. Knew what? That you were building something bigger than what anyone could see. She used to say, our Jasmine has her grandmother's eyes. She sees possibilities where others see obstacles. I never told her about the business. You didn't have to. She saw it in the way you talked about your work, the way you handled problems, the way you moved through the world. She knew you were becoming someone extraordinary. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of what I'd built and what I was about to fight to protect. What happens now? He asked. Now I go back to New York and remind some very powerful people that they should never have underestimated a woman who learned to fight from the best teacher in the world. And who was that? A man who taught me that respect isn't given, it's earned, and that once you've earned it, you never let anyone take it away. The next morning, I stood in the small garden behind my father's house, where my mother's pepper plants still grew in neat rows. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. In 12 hours, I would be back in Manhattan, ready to implement the strategy that would change everything. But first, I needed to ground myself in the values that had brought me this far. The belief that hard work mattered more than inheritance. The conviction that authenticity was more valuable than performance. The understanding that temporary setbacks could become permanent advantages if you were smart enough to use them correctly. Julian and Eleanor thought they were discarding a placeholder, a woman who'd served her purpose and could be replaced with someone more suitable. They were about to discover that they'd been living with a time bomb, and the countdown had already begun. The temporary wife was about to become their permanent nightmare, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching their perfect world crumble. The Meridian Capital offices occupied the entire 42nd floor of a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan sky like a steel needle. From David Chen's corner office, you could see the Hudson River stretching toward the horizon, its surface reflecting the afternoon sun like hammered silver. It was the kind of view that reminded you why people fought so hard to reach the top of the food chain. The numbers are extraordinary, David said, his voice carrying the kind of reverence that venture capitalists reserved for truly transformative opportunities. The manila folder between us contained a carefully curated selection of Reyes technologies, financial statements, growth projections, and strategic partnerships. I had no idea you were operating at this scale. Most people don't, I replied, accepting the coffee his assistant had brought us. I've found that invisibility can be a strategic advantage in certain circumstances, but why now? Why reveal this to us now? I set down my cup and met his gaze. Directly, because I'm entering a new phase of my career. For the past 7 years, I've been building this network while supporting my husband's pharmaceutical empire. Now I'm ready to operate independently. Independently, he repeated the word like he was testing its weight. Are we talking about a separation from Blackwood Wentworth? We're talking about a complete restructuring of my business relationships. I'm no longer interested in being a silent partner in someone else's success. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The timing is interesting. There have been rumors about instability in the Blackwood Wentworth leadership structure. Have there? I kept my voice neutral, but my pulse quickened. If rumors were already circulating, it meant my strategy was working faster than I'd anticipated. Nothing concrete, but there are whispers that some major Asian partnerships might be reconsidering their commitments. Of course there were. Because those partnerships had never been with Blackwood Wentworth, they'd been with subsidiary companies that I controlled through Reyes Technologies. And as of yesterday, those subsidiaries had begun the process of formal separation from any entanglements with Julian's empire. The Asian markets are incredibly dynamic, I said carefully. Partnerships that made sense 5 years ago might not be sustainable in today's regulatory environment. Exactly. Which is why the network you've built is so valuable. You have relationships that transcend traditional corporate structures. I do. And I'm prepared to make those relationships available to partners who understand their strategic value. What kind of partnership are you envisioning? I opened my briefcase and withdrew another folder, this one containing the proposal I'd spent the flight from Chicago preparing. I'm proposing to establish a new venture capital fund focused on emerging markets in Asia and Latin America. The fund would leverage my existing network of relationships while providing strategic guidance to portfolio companies seeking to expand internationally. David's eyes widened as he absorbed the scope of what I was proposing. The initial capital requirements alone would be substantial, but the return potential is exponential. I have distribution networks in 12 countries, regulatory relationships that took years to develop, and manufacturing partnerships that could transform market position overnight. And you'd be willing to bring all of this to a partnership with Meridian? Under the right circumstances, yes. What circumstances? Full operational control, my name on the letterhead, and complete independence from any external corporate influences. David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk as he calculated possibilities. This would be a significant departure from our traditional investment model. The most significant opportunities usually are. I'd need to discuss this with my partners, but I think we'd be very interested in exploring this further. Excellent. I'll have my legal team prepare a formal proposal. How quickly could you be operational? The infrastructure already exists. We could be making investments within 60 days. As I left the Meridian offices, I felt the familiar thrill of a successful negotiation. David Chen was hooked. He'd seen the numbers, understood the opportunity, and recognized that I was offering him access to something extraordinary. By the end of the week, I'd have a formal partnership proposal that would establish me as an independent power player in the venture capital world. But the real victory wasn't the business deal. It was the look in David's eyes when he'd realized that the woman he'd been talking to wasn't just Julian Wentworth's wife, she was a force of nature in her own right. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Preliminary papers are ready. Are you sure you want to do this? I typed back. File them. Today. The response came immediately. Holy shit, Jasmine. This is really happening. Yes, it was really happening. While Julian spent his afternoon courting Celeste Carrington, believing he was orchestrating his perfect future, I was systematically dismantling the foundation of his success. Every contract he'd signed, every partnership he'd celebrated, every expansion he'd claimed credit for, all of it was built on relationships and expertise that belonged to me. And now I was taking it all back. The next stop was a small coffin, The village, where Ethan Morgan was waiting with a cup of coffee and a recorder that looked like it had survived several decades of investigative journalism. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made him dangerous to people who preferred to keep their secrets buried. "Miss Wentworth," he said, standing as I approached his table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Thank you for making time in your schedule. I know this is unusual. In my line of work, unusual is often the most interesting." I sat across from him, noting the way he'd chosen a table in the corner where our conversation would be private. "I assume you've had a chance to review the materials I sent?" "I have. The clinical trial data alone is explosive. If these documents are authentic, they are. Then Blackwood Wentworth has been knowingly concealing serious safety issues in at least 3 of their major medications." "That's correct. The question is, how did you obtain these documents, and why are you willing to share them with me?" I'd been preparing for this question since I'd first reached out to him. I obtained them through my role as a strategic advisor to the company. As for why I'm sharing them, let's just say I've recently discovered that my relationship with Blackwood Wentworth is more complicated than I previously understood. Complicated how? That's a personal matter. What matters is that the public has a right to know about the safety issues these documents reveal. Ethan leaned forward, his expression intense. "Miss Wentworth, I've been investigating pharmaceutical corruption for 15 years. I've seen executives go to prison, companies pay billions in fines, and medications pulled from the market. If I publish this story, it won't just damage Blackwood Wentworth's reputation, it could destroy the company entirely." "I understand. Do you? Because once this story goes public, there's no going back. Your husband's company will be facing federal investigations, class action lawsuits, and regulatory sanctions that could last for years." My husband made his choices when he decided to prioritize profits over patient safety. I'm simply ensuring that those choices have consequences. Ethan studied my face for a long moment. "This is about more than corporate responsibility, isn't it? Everything is about more than it appears on the surface. But the documents speak for themselves. The story you write should focus on the facts, not my personal motivations." "Fair enough. But I need to ask, are you prepared for the retaliation? Because when this story breaks, Blackwood Wentworth is going to come after you with everything they have. Let them try." The confidence in my voice surprised even me. But it was true. I was ready for whatever Julian and Eleanor threw at me. Because while they'd been planning my replacement, I'd been building an empire. While they'd been taking me for granted, I'd been gathering evidence of their corruption. While they'd been treating me like a temporary inconvenience, I'd been preparing for permanent war. "How quickly can you publish this?" I asked. "If I work through the night, I could have the story ready by tomorrow afternoon. But I'll need additional sources to corroborate some of the more explosive claims. I can put you in touch with 3 former Blackwood Wentworth employees who witnessed the clinical trial manipulations firsthand. They've been waiting for someone to tell their story. You've been planning this for a while." "I've been preparing for the possibility that it might become necessary. Recent events have made it necessary." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll need 24 hours to verify the sources and fact-check the documents. Can you give me that?" "You can. Have 48 hours. I want the story to be bulletproof." "It will be." "Miss Wentworth?" "Yes. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. These documents show a pattern of corporate negligence that puts thousands of patients at risk. The public deserves to know." "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." As I left the cafe, I felt the weight of what I'd just set in motion. By Friday, Ethan Morgan's story would be on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. Federal investigators would be serving subpoenas, patients would be filing lawsuits, and the Blackwood Wentworth empire would be fighting for its survival. But I wasn't finished. The next phase of my strategy required a different kind of precision, the kind that could only be achieved through perfectly timed legal maneuvering. I took a cab to Sophia's law firm, where she was waiting with a stack of documents that would change everything. "Are you ready for this?" she asked, her expression serious. "I've been ready for this my entire marriage. The preliminary divorce papers are comprehensive. We're seeking dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences, but more importantly, we're challenging the validity of the prenuptial agreement based on fraud and material misrepresentation." "What kind of fraud?" "The fact that Julian entered into the marriage under false pretenses. He presented himself as someone seeking a genuine partnership, when in reality he was executing a strategic plan to exploit your expertise and then discard you. Can we prove that? With the recordings you provided? Absolutely. His own words establish that he viewed the marriage as a temporary arrangement designed to give him access to your professional network. And the material misrepresentation? The prenup was negotiated based on the assumption that you were a struggling tech worker with limited assets. The discovery of Reyes Technologies fundamentally alters the financial landscape of the marriage. What does that mean practically? It means that instead of leaving the marriage with the modest settlement outlined in the prenup, you're entitled to half of everything, including the Blackwood Wentworth assets that were built using your expertise and connections. The implications were staggering. Julian had thought he was protecting his family's wealth with that prenup. Instead, he'd created a legal framework that would allow me to claim half of everything he'd inherited. There's something else, Sophia continued. The Singapore expansion contracts. Technically, Julian signed them as CEO of Blackwood Wentworth, but the actual partnerships are with subsidiary companies that you control through Reyes Technologies, which means you own the contracts that represent nearly 40% of Blackwood Wentworth's projected revenue for the next 5 years. If you wanted to, you could terminate those partnerships and cripple the company overnight. I don't want to cripple the company. I want to control it. Sophia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Even better, by the time these papers are served, you'll be in a position to dictate the terms of any settlement. How long before Julian receives them? I'll have them served tomorrow morning, at his office, in front of his entire board of directors. The thought of Julian's face when he realized what was happening filled me with a satisfaction that was almost physical. For 7 years, I'd been the supportive wife, the invisible partner, the woman who made his success possible while remaining carefully in the background. Tomorrow, I would step into the light as his equal and potentially his superior. There's one more thing, Sophia said. I've been in contact with Margaret Weatherby's legal team. She's prepared to offer you a position as senior partner in her shipping consortium, with full operational control over Asian market development. Margaret Weatherby? How did she's been watching you for months, Jasmine. She recognized your potential long before Julian did. She's prepared to offer you a compensation package that would make you one of the highest paid executives in the shipping industry. The offer was tempting, a chance to step directly into a leadership role with an established company, bypassing the years of gradual advancement that would normally be required. But I had something better in mind. Tell Margaret I'm flattered by her offer, but I'm pursuing independent opportunities. However, I'd be very interested in discussing strategic partnerships between her shipping consortium and the venture capital fund I'm establishing. You're really going to do this? Build your own empire from scratch? I'm not building it from scratch. I've been building it for 7 years. I'm just finally ready to stop hiding it. As I left Sophia's office, my phone was buzzing with messages from Mina, confirming that the asset separation had been completed successfully. Every contract, every partnership, every strategic relationship that had made Julian successful was now officially mine. Tomorrow, when the divorce papers were served and Ethan Morgan's story hit the newspapers, Julian would discover that his temporary wife had become his permanent nightmare, and I was going to enjoy every second of watching his perfect world burn. The Forbes photographer's camera clicked rapidly as I adjusted my position behind the mahogany desk, the Manhattan skyline, creating a dramatic backdrop through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The office belonged to Meridian Capital, but David Chen had insisted I use it for the photo shoot. This is the face of the future, he'd said. You should look the part. The magazine had reached out less than 24 hours after Ethan Morgan's expos hit the newsstands. The Invisible Empire, how Jasmine Reyes built a billion-dollar tech dynasty while playing the perfect wife, was the kind of story that made careers both for journalists and for their subjects. Can you lean forward slightly? The photographer asked. I want to capture the intensity in your eyes. I complied, thinking about how much had changed in the 72 hours since Sophia had served Julian with divorce papers. The story had exploded across business media with the force of a nuclear weapon. The woman who'd been dismissed as a pharmaceutical executive's wife had been revealed as the architect of a multi-billion-dollar technology empire. But the real devastation hadn't come from the Forbes story. It had come from Ethan Morgan's investigation into Blackwood Wentworth's clinical trial manipulations, which had been published the same morning. The combination of corporate scandal and personal revelation had created a perfect storm that was destroying everything Julian had built. Perfect, the photographer said, lowering his camera. I think we have everything we need. As his team packed up their equipment, I reviewed the talking points Sophia had prepared for the interviews that would follow. The narrative was simple but powerful. Successful woman discovers her husband's betrayal, reveals the empire she built in secret, and emerges as a major player in the venture capital world. The personal details were carefully managed. No bitter recriminations, no emotional outbursts, no detailed explanations of how I'd uncovered Julian's plans. Just the facts, delivered with the kind of professional composure that made it clear I was someone to be taken seriously. My phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. Stock market opened down 8% on the Blackwood Wentworth news. Your timing was impeccable. I smiled, remembering how Julian had once told me that timing was everything in business. He'd been right about that at least. The next message was from Mina. Singapore contracts officially terminated. Blackwood Wentworth just lost $400 million in projected revenue. Even better, the contracts I'd built over 3 years of careful relationship building were now exclusively mine. Julian would have to negotiate with me if he wanted to maintain any presence in the Asian pharmaceutical market, but the most satisfying message came from an unexpected source. Celeste Carrington. Saw the Forbes article. Would love to discuss your venture capital fund over coffee. I think we have mutual interests. Interesting. Either Celeste was more strategic than I'd given her credit for, or she was beginning to understand that her association with Julian might not be the social advantage Eleanor had promised. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Sophia's name appeared on the screen. Please tell me you're somewhere private, she said without preamble. I'm in David Chen's office. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's perfect. Julian's legal team just called. They want to discuss settlement terms. Already? The papers were only served yesterday. They're panicking. The Forbes story made it clear that you're not some struggling wife who can be bullied into accepting whatever scraps they throw at you. And the clinical trial scandal has them facing federal investigations that could last for years. What are they proposing? They're willing to negotiate a settlement that would give you everything you asked for in the divorce filing. Full assets disclosure, 50% of marital property, and this is the interesting part, they're willing to discuss your continued involvement in the Singapore expansion. My continued involvement? They need you, Jasmine. Without your network, without your relationships, without your expertise, they can't maintain their Asian market position. They're offering you a consulting contract that would essentially make you a senior partner in their most profitable division. The irony was delicious. Julian had planned to use my expertise and then discard me when I was no longer useful. Now, he was begging me to stay involved in the business that couldn't survive without me. Tell them I'll consider their offer. But I want to meet with Julian personally. No lawyers, no intermediaries, just the two of us. Are you sure that's wise? I'm sure it's necessary. There are things that need to be said, and I want to say them to his face. I'll set it up. But Jasmine, be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. After ending the call, I sat in the quiet office, processing everything that had happened. 3 days ago, I'd been the invisible wife, the supporting player in Julian's success story. Now I was the featured subject in Forbes, the founder of a billion-dollar empire, and the woman who held the key to my husband's survival. The transformation was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous, because Julian wasn't the only one who might be driven to desperate measures. Eleanor Wentworth hadn't built her reputation on accepting defeat gracefully. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Miss Wentworth? The voice was crisp, professional, with the kind of authority that suggested expensive legal representation. This is Catherine Morrison from Morrison, Blake and Associates. I represent Eleanor Wentworth. I see. What can I do for you, Miss Morrison? Mrs. Wentworth would like to meet with you. She believes there may be room for a mutually beneficial arrangement that would avoid the unpleasantness of protracted legal proceedings. What kind of arrangement? That would be better discussed in person. Would you be available for lunch tomorrow? I considered the offer. Eleanor had been conspicuously absent from the media coverage of the past few days, but I'd assumed she was working behind the scenes to minimize the damage to her family's reputation. If she was reaching out through her lawyers, it meant she was ready to negotiate. I'm available. But Miss Morrison, I should mention that any conversation between Eleanor and myself will be recorded. I've learned the importance of protecting myself from misunderstandings. There was a pause. I'll inform my client of your requirement. I believe she'll find it acceptable. Excellent. I'll see you tomorrow. As I prepared to leave the office, I reflected on how completely the power dynamic had shifted. 72 hours ago, Eleanor had been the matriarch who could determine my place in the family hierarchy. Now she was the one requesting meetings, the one who needed to negotiate for her family's survival. The elevator ride to the lobby gave me time to review the messages that had been flooding my phone since the Forbes story broke. Invitations to speak at conferences, offers to join corporate boards, requests for interviews from major media outlets. The business world had taken notice of Jasmine Reyes, and they wanted to know more, but the message that mattered most was from my father. Mija, I saw the magazine article. Your mother would be so proud. You didn't just build an empire, you built it with honor. Ti amo. Honor. That was what separated me from the people who'd tried to destroy me. I'd built my success through hard work, authentic relationships, and genuine value creation. Julian had inherited his position, Eleanor had manipulated social hierarchies, and both of them had assumed that background and breeding were more important than actual achievement. They were about to learn how wrong they'd been. The next 24 hours would be crucial. I had lunch with Eleanor, where I would discover what kind of deal she thought she could offer. Then I had my personal meeting with Julian, where I would finally confront the man who'd planned to discard me like a used tissue. But first, I had one more call to make. I dialed Celeste Carrington's number, curious to see what the woman who was supposed to be my replacement really wanted. Jasmine, she answered after the second ring. Thank you for calling back. Your message mentioned mutual interests. I'm curious what you mean by that. I think we should discuss this in person. Are you familiar with the Carlisle Hotel? There's a quiet bar on the second floor. I am. When were you thinking? How about right now? I have a feeling that timing is important for both of us. An hour later, I found myself sitting across from Celeste in a dimly lit corner of the Carlisle's Beemelman's bar. She looked different than she had at the polo match, more serious, more focused, less like the decorative heiress Eleanor had been grooming. I need to be direct, she said, after we'd ordered drinks. I know what Julian and his mother were planning. I know they intended to use me to replace you. I see. And how do you feel about that? I feel like I was being set up to make the same mistake you made 7 years ago. The difference is, I had the advantage of watching what happened to you. What exactly did you see? I saw a brilliant woman being systematically undervalued by people who should have been grateful for her contributions. I saw someone being treated as disposable when she was actually irreplaceable. Celeste leaned forward, her expression intense. I've been in the shipping business my entire life. I know what it takes to build international partnerships, to navigate complex regulatory environments, to maintain relationships across cultural boundaries. What you accomplished in Asia wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. Thank you. But I'm still not sure what you're proposing. I'm proposing that we work together instead of allowing them to pit us against each other. Your venture capital fund needs operational expertise in international shipping and logistics. My family's consortium needs access to the kind of technology partnerships that your network can provide. The proposition was intriguing. Celeste was offering exactly the kind of strategic partnership that could accelerate my fund's growth while providing her with independence from the marriage trap Eleanor had been setting. What about Julian? I asked. What about him? He's a weak man who was looking for someone to make him appear strong. I'm not interested in being anyone's prop. Eleanor won't be pleased. Eleanor can be as displeased as she likes. I'm 28 years old, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being someone's convenient solution to a problem I didn't create. I studied Celeste's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But what I saw was something I recognized: a woman who'd been underestimated for too long and was ready to prove her worth. I'm interested, I said finally, but I need to handle some personal business first. Can you give me a week to sort through the divorce proceedings? Of course. But Jasmine, I want you to know that I never intended to be part of their plan to hurt you. If I'd understood what they were doing earlier, you would have what? Warned me? I would have refused to participate. even if it meant losing access to one of the most powerful families in New York? Even then, some things are more important than social position. As I left the Carlisle, I felt a strange sense of completion. The woman who was supposed to replace me had instead become my ally. Eleanor's careful orchestration had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of partnership that could challenge the Wentworth family's dominance in multiple industries. But the real test would come tomorrow, when I faced Eleanor across a negotiating table and discovered what she thought she could offer to make this all go away. The Four Seasons restaurant was Eleanor's choice, and I understood why. The iconic establishment was a temple to old money, power, where deals were made and reputations were built among the carefully cultivated elite. It was exactly the kind of place where Eleanor felt most comfortable, most in control. She was already seated when I arrived, her silver hair perfectly styled, her navy John suit, impeccable as always. But something was different about her posture, her expression. The supreme confidence that had always made her so intimidating was notably absent. "Jasmine," she said, rising to greet me with an air kiss that barely touched my cheek. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Eleanor. You look well considering." We sat across from each other at a table that had probably hosted similar negotiations for decades. The maitre d' appeared with menus, but I suspected neither of us was particularly interested in food. "I'll be direct," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same authority it always had, but with an undertone of something I'd never heard before. "Uncertainty, perhaps, or fear. The past few days have been challenging for the family, I imagine." "They have been." The Forbes article was particularly illuminating. "I had no idea you'd built such an extensive business empire. Most people didn't. I found it useful to work quietly." "Indeed. And the allegations about our clinical trials are not allegations. They're facts, supported by documentation that your son signed personally." Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Julian made some questionable decisions under pressure from the board. He's not as experienced as his father was. He's 42 years old, Eleanor. At what point does inexperience become incompetence?" That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Julian is clearly not ready to lead the company alone. He needs guidance, expertise, someone who understands the complexities of international business. He needs a handler. He needs a partner. Someone with your skills, your network, your understanding of Asian markets." I sipped my wine, letting the silence stretch between us. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we find a way to work together. The divorce proceedings are unfortunate, but they don't have to be permanent. With the right arrangement, you could maintain your position in the family, your access to our resources, your role in the company's strategic direction. In exchange for what?" "In exchange for your discretion about the clinical trial issues, your continued partnership on the Singapore expansion, and your agreement to modify the terms of the divorce settlement." The audacity was breathtaking. Eleanor was offering me the privilege of staying married to a man who'd planned to discard me in exchange for helping him cover up potentially criminal activity. "Let me make sure I understand," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You're asking me to forgive Julian for treating me like a disposable asset, to help him hide evidence of corporate fraud, and to give up my legal right to half of his assets. In return, I get to keep playing the role of the supportive wife while he courts other women. I'm asking you to be practical. You've built an impressive business, but you're still one person operating against an entire establishment. We have resources, connections, political influence that could make your life difficult. Are you threatening me, Eleanor? I'm offering you a choice. We can be partners, or we can be adversaries. But I should warn you, we've been playing this game much longer than you have." I set down my wine glass and leaned back in my chair. "You're right about one thing. You have been playing this game longer than I have. But you've been playing it wrong." "What do you mean?" "You've been playing checkers while I've been playing chess. You think this is about money, about social position, about who has the most prestigious connections. But it's not. It's about power. And the power in this situation isn't in your bank accounts or your social networks. It's in the relationships I've built, the contracts I control, and the evidence I possess." Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. "What evidence? Beyond the Clinical trial documents? Let's see. There are the recorded conversations where Julian discusses his plans to replace me. There are the financial records showing your systematic embezzlement from the family foundation. There are the emails proving that you've been manipulating FDA approval processes through strategic campaign contributions. Those are private family matters, they're federal crimes, Eleanor. And thanks to the media attention from the Forbes article, every investigative journalist in the country is now looking for their next Blackwood Wentworth story. You're bluffing. Am I? Would you like me to call Ethan Morgan and ask him about the follow-up stories he's preparing? The silence stretched between us, charged with the kind of tension that comes from the complete reversal of power dynamics. For 7 years, Eleanor had been the queen of this particular chessboard. Now she was discovering that she'd been playing against someone who'd been building her own game the entire time. What do you want? She asked finally. I want Julian to understand that his actions have consequences. I want the world to know that the Singapore expansion was built on my expertise, not his inherited privilege. I want the patients who were harmed by your clinical trial manipulations to receive justice. And personally, I want to never see either of you again. Eleanor's mask of composure finally slipped completely. You're destroying everything we've built. 3 generations of family legacy, 3 generations of inherited privilege built on the backs of people like me. People who did the actual work while you took the credit. People who made the real sacrifices while you claimed the rewards. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The forces you're unleashing are the forces you created when you decided I was disposable. When you treated me like a placeholder instead of a partner. When you assumed that your bloodline was more important than my expertise. I stood up, leaving my wine untouched. The meeting with Julian is tomorrow morning. I suggest you prepare him for the reality that his temporary wife has become his permanent problem. Jasmine, wait, no, Eleanor. I'm done waiting. I'm done being patient. I'm done being the woman who accepts whatever scraps you throw her way. I walked out of the Four Seasons with my head high, leaving Eleanor to contemplate the wreckage of her carefully laid plans. The woman who'd spent 7 years dismissing me as a temporary inconvenience was finally beginning to understand that she'd been living with a time bomb, and the countdown had reached 0. The next morning, I sat in the conference room of Sophia's law firm, waiting for Julian to arrive. The space was deliberately intimidating, floor-to-ceiling law books, portraits of distinguished attorneys, a mahogany table that had probably witnessed 1,000 negotiations. When Julian entered, flanked by 2 lawyers I didn't recognize, he looked like a man who'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his blue eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. Jasmine, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Julian. You look tired. It's been a difficult week. I imagine it has been. We sat across from each other, the legal documents spread between us like a no-man's land. For a moment, I was struck by how different he looked from the confident, commanding man I'd married. This Julian was defeated, diminished, desperate. I need to ask you something, he said finally. Did you plan this? All of it? The business empire, the evidence gathering, the perfectly timed media campaign. I planned to protect myself. The rest was just good strategy. For 7 years, you were building a case against me. For 7 years, I was building a life. It only became a case against you when you decided to destroy it. Julian's lawyers whispered something to him, but he waved them off. I need to understand. When did you know? When did you realize what Mother and I were planning? I overheard your conversation at the fundraising gala. About me being temporary, about the prenup, about Celeste Carrington, and you didn't confront me. I didn't want to confront you. I wanted to defeat you. Why? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with 7 years of history, disappointment, and betrayal. I could have given him the easy answer that I was angry, that I wanted revenge, that I was protecting my interests. But the truth was more complex. Because I loved you, I said quietly, and you turned that love into a weapon against me. Julian's composure cracked completely. I never meant. I didn't want to hurt you. You planned to discard me like a used tissue. How is that not meant to hurt? It was Mother's idea. She said the marriage was becoming a liability, that I needed someone with better social connections. Don't you dare blame Eleanor for decisions you made. You're a grown man, Julian. You chose to treat me like a temporary convenience. You chose to use my expertise while planning to replace me. You chose to make me feel like I was never good enough for your precious family. That's not true, it's completely true. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices, Julian's. Lawyers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that their client was emotionally compromised. Mr. Wentworth, one of them said, perhaps we should focus on the settlement terms. The settlement terms are simple, I said. I get half of everything, as specified in the divorce filing. Julian gets to keep his title as CEO, but only if he agrees to a consulting arrangement that gives me operational control over all international expansion. That's not possible, Julian's lawyer protested. You can't demand operational control of a company you're divorcing. I can when that company's most valuable assets are contracts that I personally negotiated and control through my subsidiary companies. I opened my briefcase and withdrew a folder containing the Singapore partnership agreements. These contracts represent $400 million in projected revenue over the next 5 years. They're all with companies that I own through Reyes Technologies. If Julian wants to maintain Blackwood Wentworth's position in the Asian market, he needs me more than I need him. Julian stared at the documents, his face pale. You're holding the company hostage. I'm reclaiming what was always mine. The relationships, the expertise, the strategic vision that made your expansion possible. You can either work with me as an equal partner, or you can watch your empire crumble without me. This isn't just about business, is it? Julian asked. This is about humiliating me. This is about justice. For 7 years, I made you successful while you planned to throw me away. Now you get to experience what it feels like to be dependent on someone else's goodwill. And if I refuse, then the Singapore contracts are terminated immediately. The clinical trial story gets picked up by every major media outlet, and you spend the next decade fighting federal investigations instead of running a pharmaceutical company. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his lawyers whispering urgently in his ear. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before: complete defeat. What do you want me to do? I want you to sign the settlement agreement. I want you to publicly acknowledge my role in the Singapore expansion. And I want you to understand that the woman you called temporary just became the most permanent part of your life. How so? Because for the rest of your career, every success you achieve will be dependent on my approval. Every partnership you pursue will require my blessing. Every strategic decision you make will need my consent. I stood up, gathering my papers. You wanted to keep me temporary, Julian. Instead, you've made me eternal. As I walked out of the conference room, I could hear Julian's lawyers frantically trying to salvage what remained of his negotiating position. But it was too late. The temporary wife had become the permanent power behind the throne, and I was going to make sure he never forgot it. The Javits Center had been transformed into a temple of innovation and ambition. Banners displaying Tech Vision 2025, the future of global commerce, hung from the soaring ceiling, while thousands of entrepreneurs, investors, and industry leaders moved through the exhibition halls like pilgrims seeking their digital salvation. The annual conference was where fortunes were made, partnerships were forged, and the next generation of business leaders announced their arrival to the world. I stood backstage at the main auditorium, my burgundy power suit chosen specifically to photograph well under the harsh conference lighting. In 10 minutes, I would deliver the keynote address that would officially launch the Phoenix Protocol, my venture capital fund designed to support underestimated entrepreneurs, particularly women and minorities who'd been systematically excluded from traditional funding networks. 5 minutes, Miss Reyes, the stage manager called out, using the name I'd legally reclaimed 3 weeks ago. The divorce had been finalized with a settlement that gave me everything I'd demanded: half of Julian's assets, operational control over all international partnerships, and most importantly, my complete independence from the Wentworth family legacy. I no longer carried Julian's name, but I carried something far more valuable: the power to reshape entire industries. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia, watching the live stream from my office, about to witness history being made. Go get them, Phoenix. Phoenix, the nickname, had emerged organically from the media coverage of my transformation. The woman who'd risen from the ashes of her marriage to become one of the most influential figures in venture capital. I'd initially resisted the dramatic imagery, but now, I embraced it. Sometimes you had to burn down your old life to build something extraordinary. The second message was from Mina, who was in the audience. Tech sector press is here in force. Bloomberg, Forbes, TechCrunch, they're all waiting to hear what you Announce. Also, spotted at least 12 potential portfolio companies in the front 3 rows. Perfect. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just about making investments, it was about making a statement. That expertise mattered more than pedigree, that innovation could come from anywhere, that the future belonged to those who earned their place, rather than inherited it. The third message was from my father, watching from Chicago with the whole family. Your mother's spirit is in that room with you, Mija. Make her proud. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 7 years of careful planning, strategic patience, and quiet determination. Everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd endured, it all led to this moment. Miss Reyes, you're on. I walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, the lights bright enough to wash out the audience but not bright enough to hide the energy in the room. These were my people, entrepreneurs who'd bet everything on their vision, investors who understood that the biggest returns came from the biggest risks, innovators who were reshaping the world one breakthrough at a time. Thank you, I said, my voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. When I was growing up in Chicago, my mother used to tell me that the most dangerous thing you could do to a phoenix was to underestimate how hot it could burn. Laughter rippled through the audience, but I could see the anticipation in their faces. They'd come to hear about venture capital and startup funding. They were about to get something much more powerful. Today, I want to talk to you about a different kind of fire. The fire that burns inside every entrepreneur who's been told they're not the right fit, who's been passed over for opportunities because they don't look like what success is supposed to look like, who's been treated as temporary when they're actually permanent solutions to permanent problems. I paused, letting my words settle over the crowd. I know this fire intimately, because for 7 years, I lived in a world that saw me as a supporting character in someone else's story. I was the wife who made her husband look good, the advisor who wasn't quite advisor enough for credit, the strategist who was strategic enough to be used but not strategic enough to be recognized. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the polished corporate presentation they'd expected. This was something raw, personal, and undeniably powerful. But here's what that world didn't understand. While they were treating me as temporary, I was building something permanent. While they were using my expertise to enhance their legacy, I was creating my own. While they were planning to discard me, I was preparing to transform not just my own life, but the lives of countless others who'd been similarly underestimated. I clicked to the first slide, showing the Phoenix Protocol logo, a stylized bird, rising from flames, wings spread wide against a backdrop of ascending graphs and global connectivity symbols. The Phoenix Protocol represents a new model for venture capital. We don't just invest money, we invest in potential. We don't just fund businesses, we fund the people who've been overlooked by traditional funding sources. We don't just seek returns, we seek transformation. The second slide showed our initial fund size, $2.5 billion, with commitments from 12 major institutional investors including Meridian Capital, the Weatherby Shipping Consortium, and surprisingly, 3 European investment firms that had been impressed by my strategic vision. But the Phoenix Protocol is more than just a venture fund. It's a comprehensive ecosystem designed to support entrepreneurs at every stage of their journey. We provide not just capital, but mentorship, strategic guidance, and access to the kind of networks that can turn brilliant ideas into global enterprises. The third slide revealed our focus areas: emerging markets, technology, sustainable innovation, healthcare solutions, and educational platforms. Each sector had been chosen based on my analysis of where the greatest opportunities existed for underrepresented entrepreneurs. Our first portfolio company is a perfect example of what we're trying to achieve. Dr. Maria Santos, a biomedical engineer from Mexico City, has developed a revolutionary diagnostic platform that can detect early-stage cancer using a simple blood test. Her technology is more accurate than existing methods, costs 90% less to deploy, and could save millions of lives in developing countries. I clicked to a video testimonial from Dr. Santos, her passion for her work evident in every word. For 3 years, I pitched this technology to American investors. They were impressed by the science, but concerned about my ability to scale globally. They wanted to fund the technology but replace me with a more experienced CEO. The audience shifted uncomfortably. They recognized the pattern: brilliant innovator, questionable leadership assumptions, talented person sidelined for their own invention. The Phoenix Protocol didn't just fund Dr. Santos' technology. We funded Dr. Santos. We believed that the person who invented the solution was probably the best person to implement it. We provided her with the resources, the guidance, and the network she needed to prove that assumption correct. The next slide showed Dr. Santos' company's progress: FDA approval pending, partnerships with hospitals in 6 countries, and a valuation that had tripled in 8 months. That's the Phoenix Protocol difference. We don't just invest in businesses, we invest in people. We don't just fund technology, we fund the visionaries who create it. We don't just seek profits, we seek transformation. I spent the next 20 minutes outlining our investment philosophy, our portfolio strategy, and our commitment to supporting entrepreneurs who'd been systematically excluded from traditional funding channels. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions, clearly excited about the possibilities, but the real announcement came at the end. There's one more thing I want to share with you today. The Phoenix Protocol isn't just about funding individual companies. It's about creating a new model for how business gets done. That's why I'm pleased to announce that we're acquiring the Blackwood building in Manhattan, the 60-story tower that will become the headquarters for our portfolio companies, our accelerator programs, and our global operations. The audience erupted in applause. The Blackwood building had been the headquarters of Blackwood Wentworth Pharmaceuticals for generations. Now it would house the empire I'd built from the ashes of my marriage. The building will be renamed the Phoenix Tower, I continued, and it will stand as a symbol of what's possible when we stop underestimating people and start investing in their potential. As I left the stage to a standing ovation, I felt the satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just a business venture, it was a declaration of war against every system that had ever treated talented people as temporary inconveniences. The next 2 hours were a blur of media interviews, investor meetings, and networking conversations. Every major business publication wanted to know about my transformation from pharmaceutical executive's wife to venture capital powerhouse. Every investor wanted to understand how I'd built a $2.5 billion fund in less than 6 months. But the conversation that mattered most came from an unexpected source: Jasmine. The voice was soft and certain, carrying an emotional weight that I recognized immediately. I turned to find Julian standing behind me, his appearance more disheveled than I'd ever seen it. His usually perfect hair was unkempt, his expensive suit wrinkled, his blue eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He looked like a man who'd aged a decade in the past month. Julian, I'm surprised to see you here. I needed to see this, to understand what you've built. And what do you think? I think I never knew you at all. We stood in the busy conference corridor, surrounded by the energy of innovation and ambition, while the ghost of our marriage hung between us like a wall of glass, visible, impenetrable, and ultimately fragile. That's not true, I said quietly. You knew exactly who I was. You just didn't think it mattered. I was wrong. About everything. About you, about us, about what was important. Yes, you were. Is there any chance? He stopped, recognizing the futility of the question before he finished asking it. No, Julian, there's no chance. You had 7 years to see me as a partner instead of a placeholder. You chose to plan my replacement instead. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm not angry anymore, I said, and realized it was true. I'm grateful. If you hadn't betrayed me, I never would have discovered what I was truly capable of. The Phoenix Protocol. It's extraordinary. The vision, the execution, the impact you're going to have, the impact I'm already having. Dr. Santos Diagnostic Platform launches in 3 countries next month. Our educational technology portfolio is revolutionizing learning in underserved communities. Our sustainable innovation investments are creating jobs and reducing environmental impact. I'm proud of you. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with irony and regret. The man who'd planned to discard me was now proud of what I'd accomplished. After escaping his plans, I don't need your pride, Julian. I never did. I needed your respect, your partnership, your recognition that I was building something valuable. But you were so focused on managing me that you never bothered to truly see me. I see you now. Now it's too late. He nodded slowly, accepting the finality of what we'd lost. For what it's worth, I hope the Phoenix Protocol succeeds beyond your wildest dreams. It will. Because it's built on something you never understood: the power of authentic relationships, genuine value creation, and earned respect rather than inherited privilege. As Julian walked away, I felt the last emotional connection to my old life dissolve. The woman who'd been Jasmine Wentworth was truly gone, replaced by someone stronger, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous to anyone who tried to underestimate her. The phoenix had risen. And she was just getting started. The courthouse steps were slick with October rain, but I barely noticed as I descended toward the waiting car. The manila envelope in my briefcase contained the final divorce decree, the official documentation that Jasmine Reyes was no longer married to Julian Wentworth. 7 years of legal entanglement dissolved into a stack of papers that would gather dust in some filing cabinet. But the real victory wasn't in the courthouse behind me, it was in the phone that had been buzzing with notifications for the past hour. News alerts, interview requests, and congratulations from colleagues who understood that today marked more than the end of a marriage. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in American business history. Where to, Miss Reyes? My driver asked as I settled into the back seat of the Tesla. I'd switched from traditional luxury cars to electric vehicles as part of my commitment to supporting sustainable innovation. Every choice now carried symbolic weight. Phoenix Tower. Please. The building that had once housed Blackwood Wentworth Pharmaceuticals was now the headquarters of my empire. The renovation had been completed in record time, transforming the sterile corporate environment into a dynamic innovation hub. The lobby featured a living wall of plants from around the world, representing the global nature of our portfolio. The executive floors had been redesigned as collaborative spaces where entrepreneurs could work alongside seasoned investors and strategic advisors, but the most significant change was on the building's facade. Where the Blackwood Wentworth logo had once proclaimed 4 generations of pharmaceutical dominance, the Phoenix Protocol symbol now rose 50 feet above the Manhattan skyline, a permanent reminder that transformation was possible, that legacy was something you built rather than inherited. As we navigated the afternoon traffic, I opened my laptop to review the day's developments. The Phoenix Protocol had officially closed its series of funding round, raising $2.5 billion from institutional investors who'd been impressed by our strategic vision and track record. More importantly, we'd announced partnerships with 3 major universities to establish innovation incubators on their campuses. The first message was from Dr. Maria Santos, whose diagnostic platform had just received FDA approval. Jasmine, I can't thank you enough. When you invested in my company, you invested in my vision. Today, that vision becomes reality. The first commercial units will save lives within 60 days. The second was from David Chen at Meridian Capital. The Phoenix Protocol is already generating returns that exceed our most optimistic projections. More importantly, it's creating the kind of social impact that attracts the best entrepreneurs. This is what venture capital should be. The third was from Margaret Weatherby, whose shipping consortium had become a key strategic partner. Your model is revolutionizing how we think about international expansion. The entrepreneurs you're funding aren't just building businesses, they're building bridges between cultures and markets. But the message that meant the most came from my father. Mija saw the news about the divorce being finalized. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become, not because you succeeded, but because you succeeded with honor. Honor. The word that had defined my mother's life and now defined mine. The difference between earning respect and demanding it. Between building something lasting and inheriting something temporary. The phone rang as we pulled up to Phoenix Tower. Sophia's name appeared on the screen. How are you feeling? She asked, without preamble. Officially divorced. Officially free. Officially ready to change the world. Any regrets? About the divorce? None. About the marriage? Only that it took me 7 years to understand that I was building a life with someone who saw me as a temporary convenience. Julian's loss is the world's gain. The Phoenix Protocol is already being studied by business schools as a new model for venture capital. It's not just about the money, Sophia. It's about proving that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone. Speaking of which, I have news. Eleanor Wentworth's legal troubles are escalating. The FBI investigation into the foundation's financial irregularities is expanding, and there's talk of federal charges. I'm not surprised. Her embezzlement scheme was sophisticated but not sophisticated enough to hide from serious scrutiny. And Julian? What about him? The clinical trial scandal is destroying Blackwood Wentworth's reputation. Their stock price has fallen 60%, and they're facing lawsuits from patients who were harmed by the medications they knew were dangerous. That's what happens when you prioritize profits over people. Do you feel any sympathy for him? I considered the question as the elevator carried me toward my office on the 40th floor. Did I feel sympathy for Julian? For the man who'd planned to discard me like a used tissue? For the executive who'd built his success on my invisible labor? For the husband who'd treated our marriage like a business arrangement with an expiration date? No, I said finally. I don't feel sympathy for him. I feel grateful to him. Grateful? If Julian had truly loved me, if he'd actually seen me as a partner instead of a placeholder, I never would have discovered what I was capable of. His betrayal forced me to become someone I never knew I could be. The phoenix, exactly. He tried to burn me down, but he just gave me the fire I needed to rise. I ended the call and walked into my office, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The city stretched out below me, millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their futures, fighting for their place in the world. My desk was covered with proposals from entrepreneurs seeking funding, strategic plans for expanding into new markets, and invitations to speak at conferences around the world. The Phoenix Protocol had become more than a venture capital fund, it had become a movement. But the document that captured my attention was a leather-bound folder containing the final report on our first year of operations. The numbers were extraordinary. 47 companies funded, 12 successful exits, and a portfolio valuation that had tripled our initial investment. More importantly, 68% of our portfolio companies were founded by women, minorities, or immigrants who'd been overlooked by traditional funding sources. I opened the folder to the executive summary, which began with a quote from my mother. "The most dangerous thing you can do to a phoenix is underestimate how hot it can burn." The report detailed how we'd identified and funded innovations that established investors had missed. The biomedical engineer who'd developed a revolutionary cancer diagnostic. The software developer who'd created an educational platform that was transforming learning in underserved communities. The materials scientist who'd invented a sustainable packaging solution that was replacing plastic in 12 countries. Each investment represented more than just financial returns, it represented validation for entrepreneurs who'd been told they weren't the right fit, who'd been passed over for opportunities because they didn't look like what success was supposed to look like. My intercom buzzed. "Miss Reyes, there's a Celeste Carrington here to see you. She says she has a meeting. Send her in." Celeste entered my office wearing a navy business suit that projected competence and confidence. The decorative heiress Eleanor had tried to use as my replacement had transformed herself into a formidable businesswoman with her own shipping empire. Our partnership had proved mutually beneficial. Her logistical expertise complemented my tech investments, while my network opened doors that had been closed to her because of her age and gender. "Congratulations on finalizing the divorce," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "How does it feel to be officially free? Like I can finally breathe." For 7 years, I was trying to be someone else's version of the perfect wife. Now I get to be myself. And who is that? Someone who doesn't accept limitations imposed by other people's expectations. Someone who builds rather than inherits. Someone who earns respect instead of demanding it. Someone who turns temporary setbacks into permanent advantages. Exactly. Celeste opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "I have the final numbers on our joint logistics platform. The shipping solutions we've developed for your portfolio companies are reducing costs by an average of 30% while improving delivery times by 40%. That's extraordinary. What's the global expansion timeline? We can be operational in 12 additional countries within 6 months. The demand from your portfolio companies is driving faster growth than we initially projected. And the partnership with your family's consortium? My father is finally starting to understand that I'm not just his daughter, I'm his successor. The innovations we've developed together are revolutionizing international shipping. How does it feel to be taken seriously after years of being underestimated? Like I imagine it feels to be you. Powerful, dangerous, unstoppable." We spent the next hour reviewing strategic plans, investment opportunities, and the global expansion of our partnership. The woman who was supposed to be my replacement had become my strongest ally, proving that the most powerful partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than manufactured compatibility. As Celeste prepared to leave, she paused at my office. Door. Jasmine, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Julian had actually valued you? If he'd seen you as a true partner instead of a placeholder? Sometimes. But then I remember that people reveal their true nature under pressure. Julian had 7 years to see me as an equal, 7 years to build something genuine with me. He chose to plan my replacement instead. And now he gets to watch me build something extraordinary without him. The Phoenix Protocol will outlast his pharmaceutical empire, impact more lives, and create more value than anything he could have imagined. The woman they called temporary becomes eternal. Exactly. After Celeste left, I stood at my window watching the sun set over Manhattan. The city's lights were beginning to twinkle, each one representing someone's dream, someone's ambition, someone's determination to build something lasting. My phone chimed with a news alert. Phoenix Protocol founder named to Forbes' most powerful women list. The article described my transformation from pharmaceutical executive's wife to venture capital powerhouse, but it missed the deeper story. This wasn't just about business success, it was about personal evolution, about refusing to accept other people's limitations, about turning betrayal into empowerment. The second alert was more satisfying. Blackwood Wentworth Pharmaceuticals faces federal investigation. Julian's empire was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption, while the woman he'd planned to discard was building something that would outlast any dynasty. I opened my laptop and began composing an email to the entrepreneurs in our portfolio. Tomorrow, I would announce the Phoenix Protocol's second fund, $5 billion raised from investors who'd been impressed by our track record and inspired by our vision. The letter would remind them that they were part of something bigger than individual success. They were part of a movement that was changing how the world thought about innovation, entrepreneurship, and the power of authentic leadership. The email began, "Dear Phoenix family, when I launched this fund, I told you that the most dangerous thing you can do to a phoenix is underestimate how hot it can burn. Today, I want to tell you something more important. The most powerful thing you can do is help other phoenixes rise." As I typed, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The girl from Chicago who'd dreamed of changing the world. The Harvard MBA who'd believed in the power of authentic partnerships. The wife who'd devoted 7 years to supporting someone else's vision. The woman who'd discovered that betrayal could be the catalyst for transformation. Each stage had been necessary. Each setback had been valuable. Each moment of doubt had strengthened my resolve. Julian had thought he was discarding a placeholder, but he'd actually been releasing a force of nature. The final paragraph of my email captured everything I'd learned. Remember that your temporary setbacks are not your permanent story. Remember that the people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest gift, the element of surprise. Remember that the most powerful revenge is not destruction but creation. Build something extraordinary. Build something lasting. Build something that proves that you are never temporary at all. I sent the email and closed the laptop, feeling the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a future unlimited. The Phoenix Protocol would continue to grow, to innovate, to transform lives and industries. But more importantly, it would serve as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who's learned to rise from the ashes. The temporary wife had become eternal. The placeholder had become irreplaceable. The woman they'd tried to discard had become the architect of their obsolescence. And in the end, that was the most beautiful revenge of all. Outside my window, Manhattan glittered like a field of stars, each light representing infinite possibilities. Tomorrow, I would continue building the empire I'd dreamed of as a girl in Chicago. Tomorrow, I would support more entrepreneurs who'd been underestimated and overlooked. Tomorrow, I would prove again that the most powerful transformations come not from inheritance, but from resilience. The phoenix had risen, and she was just getting started. As I prepared to leave the office, my phone buzzed with one final message. It was from an unknown number, but the words were unmistakable. "I saw the news about your success. I always knew you were extraordinary. I'm sorry I never told you when it mattered." Jay stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Julian's regret was his burden to carry, not mine to absolve. The woman who might have been moved by his apology no longer existed. In her place stood someone who'd learned that the most important approval was the kind you gave yourself. The temporary wife was gone forever. The phoenix was eternal, and she was magnificent. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.